Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried beneath our feet, waiting centuries to reveal truths that could rewrite history as we know it? What if I told you that a routine archaeological excavation in eastern Tennessee uncovered evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about Native American involvement in the Civil War, and the shocking role one Cherokee woman played in a conflict that tore our nation apart? This is the extraordinary story of what archaeologists found buried alongside a Union Army uniform belonging to a Cherokee woman. Artifacts so unexpected and disturbing that historians initially refused to believe their authenticity. Before you continue watching this incredible true story that's been deliberately obscured from our history books, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue bringing these hidden chapters of American history to light, stories that powerful institutions would prefer remain buried forever. The story begins in the fall of 2017, when construction workers breaking ground for a new shopping center near Cleveland, Tennessee, struck something metallic approximately 6 feet below the surface. Following state regulations requiring archaeological assessment of potentially historic sites, work was halted, and a team from the University of Tennessee's Archaeological Research Laboratory was called to investigate. "We expected to find typical Civil War-era artifacts," recalled Dr. Michael Runningwolf, the Cherokee archaeologist who led the excavation. Eastern Tennessee saw significant military activity during the war, with divided loyalties between Union and Confederate forces. Finding buttons, bullets, or even weapons wouldn't have been unusual. What we discovered instead was something none of us was prepared for. Initial excavation revealed the partial remains of what appeared to be a hastily constructed wooden structure, possibly a cabin or small outbuilding that had collapsed and been buried over time. Carbon dating of the wood indicated construction sometime between 1861 and 1863, precisely during the Civil War period. As the team carefully removed layers of soil and debris, they discovered human remains. The skeleton was immediately distinctive, noted Dr. Sarah Blackfeather, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the project. The individual was female, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, with skeletal indicators suggesting an age between 25 and 35 years at time of death. Cranial and dental morphology strongly indicated Native American ancestry, specifically consistent with Cherokee physical characteristics. What made the discovery truly remarkable, however, was what had been buried with the woman. She was dressed in the remnants of a Union Army uniform, specifically a modified version of the standard infantry jacket and trousers issued to soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland, which operated extensively throughout Tennessee. The uniform had been altered to fit a smaller frame, with evidence of hand-stitching that suggested field modifications rather than official military tailoring. Finding a Native American woman in a Union uniform was unusual enough, Runningwolf explained, but it was what we found carefully arranged around the body that left us truly stunned. Positioned around the skeleton, in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, were 37 human finger bones, each one blackened and preserved through a process that suggested intentional mummification. Each bone had been carefully wrapped in a small square of cotton cloth and tied with horsehair. Most disturbing of all, each package had been labeled with a small wooden tag bearing a name, rank, and unit designation of Confederate soldiers. The implications were impossible to ignore, said Dr. Elizabeth Tallchief, historian of Native American involvement in the Civil War. "We were looking at trophies taken from enemy combatants, a practice documented among certain warrior cultures throughout history, but never before confirmed among Cherokee participants in the Civil War, and certainly never associated with a female combatant." Initial reactions from the academic community ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief. Several prominent historians suggested the site had been tampered with or even deliberately staged as a hoax. Others proposed that the artifacts had been mixed from different historical periods through soil disruption or earlier construction at the site. Dr. James White Rever, curator of military artifacts at the Smithsonian Institution, was among the skeptics. The idea of a female Cherokee fighting in Union uniform is unusual, but not entirely without precedent. Several hundred women are documented to have disguised themselves as men to fight for both sides during the Civil War. Similarly, approximately 3,000 Native Americans served in Union forces. What made this claim extraordinary, and thus requiring extraordinary evidence, was the collection of human remains arranged in what appeared to be a ritual context. This suggested not just military service, but a level of warrior culture practice that would have been extremely unusual in the context of organized Civil War military units. To resolve these questions, the research team employed a comprehensive battery of scientific tests. DNA analysis confirmed that the skeleton was indeed female, with genetic markers consistent with Cherokee ancestry. Carbon dating of both the uniform fabric and the preserved finger bones placed them within the same time period, between 1862 and 1864. Most conclusively, detailed analysis of soil layers above and around the burial showed no evidence of later disturbance or intrusion that might have introduced materials from different time periods. The scientific evidence was unequivocal, Running Wolf stated. This was a genuine Civil War-era burial of a Cherokee woman in a modified Union uniform, surrounded by what could only be described as war trophies taken from Confederate soldiers. The next question was obvious. Who was she? Identifying the woman proved challenging, but not impossible. The research team cross-referenced Union Army muster rolls with Cherokee tribal records from the period, focusing particularly on the eastern band of Cherokee, who had managed to avoid the forced removal along the Trail of Tears in the 1830s by retreating into the most remote regions of the Smoky Mountains. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the diary of Colonel William Thomas, a white man who had been legally adopted by the Cherokee and who commanded the Thomas Legion, a Confederate unit composed primarily of Cherokee soldiers from western North Carolina. Thomas's diary, housed in the archives of the University of North Carolina, contained multiple references to a female Cherokee scout working for Union forces who had become something of a bogeyman among his men. "My scouts report another ambush along the Tennessee border," Thomas wrote in an entry dated July 18, 1863. "3 men killed, all found missing their trigger fingers. The men are increasingly convinced these attacks are the work of the woman they call Tsiu Gansini, the ghost woman. Whether she is one person or many, or merely a phantom conjured from frontier fears, I cannot say. What is certain is that these precise, brutal attacks are undermining morale more effectively than a regiment of conventional forces." Further research uncovered additional references to this mysterious figure in both military correspondence and personal letters written by soldiers serving in eastern Tennessee. A letter from Lieutenant Samuel Richards of the 23rd Kentucky Infantry to his wife, dated September 3, 1863, provided particularly valuable details. "You ask if the rumors of an Indian woman fighting for our side are true. I can confirm that there is indeed such a person, though few have seen her directly. She operates as a scout and irregular fighter behind enemy lines, typically alone or with 1 or 2 companions. The Cherokee among our guides call her Running Deer, though whether this is her true name or a nom de guerre, I cannot say. What I know with certainty is that she has provided intelligence of extraordinary accuracy regarding Confederate movements, and that enemy soldiers found dead after her raids are invariably missing the index finger of their right hand, the trigger finger, in a grim symbolism that requires no explanation. Perhaps the most detailed account came from the military records of General Ambrose Burnside, who commanded Union forces in eastern Tennessee during 1863. A confidential report in his papers, discovered in the National Archives by the research team, outlined the recruitment and activities of special scouts drawn from local populations, including Native Americans familiar with the challenging mountain terrain. One passage, previously overlooked by historians, proved crucial. Among our most effective operatives is a Cherokee woman, approximately 30 years of age, who presents herself as Sarah Walkingstick. She claims to have lost her entire family during a Confederate raid on a settlement near the North Carolina border, suspected of harboring Unionist sympathizers. Her knowledge of the terrain is unparalleled, and her tracking skills have proven invaluable. Her methods are sometimes more severe than military protocol would dictate. But in the irregular warfare of this region, such excesses are difficult to prevent, and, in truth, have produced a fear among enemy forces that serves our strategic objectives. With this name, Sarah Walkingstick, the research team was able to trace the woman's background through Cherokee tribal records. She was born in 1835 near what is now Cherokee, North Carolina, to a mother from the Wolf clan and a father who had been among the small number of Cherokee who fought in the Seminole Wars in Florida. The family had evaded the forced removal of the Trail of Tears by retreating deep into the mountains, where they lived in a small community of other Cherokee who had similarly escaped federal troops. According to an oral history recorded by anthropologist James Mooney in the 1890s, Sarah had shown unusual aptitude for hunting and tracking from an early age, skills typically associated with male roles in Cherokee society. A tribal elder interviewed by Mooney recalled, "She could move through the forest like smoke, leaving no trace of her passing." Her father, who had learned warcraft fighting alongside white soldiers in Florida, taught her not just to hunt game, but to track human prey. Some thought it unnatural for a woman, but others said she carried the spirit of Tsiyu, the legendary warrior woman of ancient times. Sarah's transformation from mountain hunter to Union scout appears to have occurred in the spring of 1862, following an incident documented in both military reports and local newspaper accounts. Confederate forces, responding to reports of Unionist activity in eastern Tennessee, conducted a series of raids on isolated homesteads and small communities suspected of harboring Union sympathizers. One such raid targeted a small mixed settlement near the Tennessee-North Carolina border, where several Cherokee families, including Sarah's, lived alongside white settlers with Union leanings. The raid, conducted by irregular Confederate cavalry under the command of Captain William Davidson, was particularly brutal. Military discipline broke down, and what began as a search for Unionist sympathizers devolved into an indiscriminate attack. 23 civilians were killed, including Sarah's husband, parents, and 2 young children. A report filed by a Union officer who investigated the aftermath described the scene. The settlement was razed entirely, with all buildings burned to the ground. Bodies were found in positions indicating they had been slain while fleeing rather than resisting. Most disturbing were signs of deliberate cruelty, including evidence that some victims had been forced to witness the execution of family members before meeting their own end. Sarah was apparently absent during the attack, having gone into the mountains on a hunting expedition. Upon returning to find her family and community destroyed, she disappeared into the wilderness. Confederate reports from the following weeks describe a series of increasingly bold attacks on isolated Confederate positions and supply lines in the region. Attacks characterized by precision, stealth, and the signature removal of the right index finger from each victim. By summer 1862, Union intelligence officers operating in the area had identified the person behind these attacks and recruited her into more formal service. While never officially enlisted, Native Americans would not be formally eligible for military service until later in the war, and women were officially excluded entirely. Sarah was issued a uniform, equipment, and operated under the loose command structure of Union intelligence services. She essentially functioned as what we would now call a special operations force, explained military historian Colonel Robert Whitehawk, retired. Her intimate knowledge of the terrain gave her advantages no conventional soldier could match, while her tracking skills and Cherokee hunting techniques made her nearly impossible to counter using standard military tactics. Most significantly, she understood psychological warfare in ways that went beyond conventional military thinking of the era. The psychological impact of Sarah's operations was documented in numerous Confederate sources. A report from Confederate Brigadier General John Pegram to his superiors in August 1863 noted, "Our forces in eastern Tennessee are facing not merely conventional opposition, but a form of irregular warfare for which they are poorly prepared. Soldiers speak of an Indian woman who strikes without warning and vanishes without trace, leaving behind mutilated bodies as grim calling cards." While rational men recognize this as merely effective guerrilla tactics, the psychological effect on troops operating in unfamiliar mountain terrain cannot be overstated. Some units refuse night operations entirely, and desertion rates have increased markedly. Third, what made Sarah particularly effective was her integration of traditional Cherokee spiritual practices into her warfare techniques. Among the artifacts found at the burial site were several small medicine bundles containing herbs traditional to Cherokee healing and spiritual practices, along with carved wooden symbols associated with the Wolf Clan, known in Cherokee tradition for their role as warriors and protectors. Dr. Rebecca Nighthawk, expert in Cherokee spiritual traditions at the University of North Carolina, explained the significance. The arrangement of the finger bones in a specific pattern around her body suggests she was engaging in what Cherokee would recognize as war medicine, spiritual practices intended not just to protect the warrior, but to project power over enemies. The blackening and preservation of the finger bones, combined with the naming tags, indicates a ritual purpose beyond mere trophy-taking. In Cherokee spiritual understanding, possessing a part of an enemy gave you continuing power over them, even after their death. This spiritual dimension adds a layer of complexity to understanding Sarah's actions. Rather than viewing the collection of fingers as merely gruesome war trophies, they can be understood as part of a spiritual practice intended to protect her people and territory from those she perceived as invaders, a framework that had deep roots in Cherokee cultural traditions predating European contact. It's important to understand that Sarah was operating within a dual cultural context, emphasized Dr. Talchief. She had adopted elements of Western warfare, as evidenced by her use of firearms and her service within Union command structures, but she integrated these with traditional Cherokee spiritual and martial practices. This wasn't primitive savagery, as some early commentators suggested when our findings were first published. It was a sophisticated cultural adaptation, using traditional spiritual frameworks to process and respond to the trauma of losing her family and community. The precise circumstances of Sarah's death remain uncertain. The condition of her remains indicated no obvious cause, such as battlefield injury. Analysis of bone and tissue samples, however, revealed elevated levels of lead and arsenic, suggesting possible poisoning. Whether deliberate or accidental remains impossible to determine with certainty. The hasty nature of her burial, combined with the careful arrangement of her collected trophies around her body, suggests that those who buried her were likely Cherokee themselves, or at least familiar with Cherokee practices. They took care to honor her warrior status, while ensuring her spiritual tools remained with her for the journey to the afterlife. Whoever buried her understood the significance of what she carried, noted Dr. Nighthawk. In Cherokee belief, if these ritual objects had been separated from her at death, her spirit might be unable to complete its journey, remaining bound to the earthly plane as a ghost, or uktina, dangerous spirit. The careful arrangement indicates a burial conducted with appropriate spiritual knowledge, even if circumstances required haste. Historical records provide some possible context for the timing and circumstances of her death. Union military correspondence from December 1863 mentions the loss of a valuable intelligence asset in eastern Tennessee, coinciding with a Confederate counteroffensive in the region. A letter from a Union officer to his brother, dated January 1864, offers more specific details. Our Cherokee scout, the woman who struck such fear into rebel hearts, was found dead at her camp last week. Circumstances suggest treachery rather than battle. Certain local elements, though professing Union loyalty, had grown uncomfortable with her methods and the attention they drew from Confederate forces. It would not surprise me to learn that her evening meal had been doctored by those ostensibly on our own side. This suggestion of poisoning by nominal allies aligns with the forensic evidence and adds a layer of tragic irony to Sarah's story. Having survived countless high-risk operations behind enemy lines, she may have ultimately fallen victim to the complex internal politics of a region where loyalties were rarely as clear-cut as military affiliations suggested. The burial site contained one final element that researchers found particularly significant: a modified 1860 Colt Army revolver with distinct adaptations. The weapon had been customized with Cherokee symbols carved into the grip, and the barrel had been shortened for easier concealment. Most notably, the trigger guard had been enlarged and reshaped to accommodate 2 fingers rather than 1, a modification that would allow the user to fire accurately using the middle finger after losing or injuring the index finger. This modification suggests something remarkable, explained firearms historian Dr. Thomas Blackhorse. It appears that Sarah had deliberately removed her own right index finger, mirroring what she did to her enemies. This act of ritual self-modification would have profound significance in Cherokee warrior traditions, symbolically taking on the power of her enemies by sharing in their sacrifice. It also served the practical purpose of demonstrating that she could continue to fight effectively despite missing the finger normally used for firing a weapon. This theory was confirmed by analysis of Sarah's skeletal remains, which showed that her right index finger had indeed been removed, with bone healing patterns indicating this had occurred months before her death. Unlike the clean cuts on her victims, however, her own finger appeared to have been removed through a more ceremonial process, with marks suggesting ritual preparation of the amputation site. This self-amputation would have represented a profound spiritual commitment, Dr. Nighthawk explained. In Cherokee tradition, voluntary physical sacrifice demonstrated dedication to one's spiritual path and purpose. By removing the same finger she took from her enemies, she was creating a powerful spiritual connection, essentially stating that she was willing to bear the same mark she inflicted, binding her fate to theirs in the spiritual realm. The discovery of Sarah Walkingstick's burial site has forced historians to reconsider several aspects of Civil War history, particularly regarding the role of women and Native Americans in the conflict. While approximately 400 women are known to have disguised themselves as men to fight for both Union and Confederate forces, Sarah's case is unique in that she served openly as a woman, leveraging her gender rather than hiding it. Confederate soldiers were conditioned to look for male threats, explained Dr. Patricia Strongbow, historian of women in warfare. A Cherokee woman could move through checkpoints or near encampments while raising far fewer suspicions than a male scout would have. Rather than a limitation, her gender became a strategic advantage in intelligence gathering. Similarly, while Native American participation in the Civil War has been increasingly acknowledged by historians in recent decades, the integration of traditional indigenous warfare practices within the structure of Western military conflict has received less attention. Sarah's case demonstrates how some Native American participants brought not just their physical skills, but their cultural and spiritual frameworks into their service, fighting a war that was, from their perspective, as much about tribal survival as about Union or Confederate causes. Sarah Walkingstick represents a form of cultural resistance that goes beyond simply choosing a side in the white man's war. noted Dr. Runningwolf. She adapted the conflict to her own cultural framework, fighting not primarily for abstract notions of union or secession, but for the concrete protection of her people and territory, using methods that maintained Cherokee spiritual and martial traditions even while operating within Western military structures. The archaeological team made another discovery that shed light on a particularly mysterious aspect of Sarah's operations. Among the items buried with her was a small leather-bound journal, its pages largely degraded, but with portions still legible after careful conservation efforts. The journal, written primarily in the Cherokee syllabary developed by Sequoyah in the early 19th century, with occasional entries in English, appeared to be Sarah's personal record of her activities. Dr. Rebecca Yellowhawk, a Cherokee linguist who worked on translating the recovered text, described its contents. The journal reveals that Sarah was not working entirely alone, as most historical accounts had suggested. She was part of a small network of Cherokee women who had lost family members to Confederate actions and had banded together in response. The group never numbered more than 5 or 6 individuals, but they coordinated their activities across a substantial territory, creating the impression of a much larger force. One partially preserved entry, dated August 1863, provided crucial insight into the group's methods. "We move like ghosts through their camps. Elizabeth takes their maps, while Mary counts their supplies. I study the officers, learning their faces for when we meet again. They see only Indian women, invisible as trees or rocks to their eyes. Their blindness is our strength." This entry reveals the sophisticated intelligence gathering that preceded the more dramatic aspects of their operations. Sarah and her companions apparently exploited racial and gender prejudices that rendered Native American women effectively invisible to white soldiers, allowing them to move through Confederate territory, gathering critical information before conducting targeted strikes. This challenges the narrative that Sarah was simply a vengeful fighter conducting terror raids, explained Dr. Telchief. Her operations were far more strategic. The journal indicates detailed reconnaissance, careful target selection, and coordination with conventional Union forces. She wasn't just killing Confederate soldiers at random. She was systematically eliminating key personnel, disrupting supply lines, and collecting intelligence that proved valuable for larger Union operations in the region. The most disturbing entries in the journal concerned the ritual removal of fingers from her victims. One partially legible passage offered insight into the spiritual framework behind this practice. Each finger carries their spirit's power. As the moon grows full, I place them in the sacred circle, speaking their names to the ancestors. Their strength flows into our people, returning what was taken from us. This is not the white man's war medicine, but the old way, the true way. Thief. This passage suggests that Sarah viewed her actions not merely as combat tactics, but as spiritual warfare conducted according to Cherokee traditions. The collection of fingers was part of a ritual process intended to harness the strength of defeated enemies and redirect it toward the protection of her community, a concept with deep roots in traditional Cherokee spiritual practices. Dr. Nighthawk explained, in Cherokee cosmology, power could be transferred from one being to another. By taking the trigger finger, the source of an enemy's ability to inflict harm, and subjecting it to ritual treatment, Sarah was essentially capturing and redirecting that harmful power. From a Western perspective, this might seem barbaric, but within her cultural framework, it was a sophisticated spiritual technology for protecting her people. The journal also revealed another dimension of Sarah's story that had been entirely absent from historical records: her role as a healer as well as a fighter. Several entries described using traditional Cherokee plant medicines to treat injured Union soldiers, civilian refugees, and even, in one poignant passage, a wounded Confederate soldier who had been abandoned by his retreating unit. Found the boy soldier by the creek. she wrote in an entry from October 1863. No more than 16 summers, shot through the shoulder and burning with fever. He wears the gray coat, but his eyes hold no hatred. I made the white oak bark tea and packed the wound with spiderweb and chickweed, left him with water and cornmeal. The killing hand must also know healing. This is balance. This commitment to healing alongside warfare reflects the Cherokee concept of balance that was central to their worldview, rather than seeing combat and healing as separate or contradictory activities. Traditional Cherokee culture viewed them as complementary aspects of protecting and sustaining the community. Sarah wasn't simply a killer, emphasized Dr. Running Wolf. The journal reveals a woman deeply committed to Cherokee concepts of balance and spiritual harmony, even while engaging in warfare. She understood her role as both destroyer and preserver, bringing death to enemies, but also life and healing to her community, and even, when circumstances warranted, to wounded enemies who no longer posed a threat. Perhaps the most significant revelation from the journal came from entries describing Sarah's ultimate purpose. While her initial motivation clearly stemmed from avenging her family, her vision expanded over time to encompass the broader survival of Cherokee culture and people. A particularly striking entry from November 1863 read, "The white men fight for union or secession, words that mean nothing to our people. I fight for what remains of Cherokee land and life. When their war ends, whichever side claims victory will turn their eyes west to our mountains once again. I take these fingers and make this medicine not just to win their war, but to prepare for what comes after, to make them remember fear when they look to our hills." This passage suggests that Sarah viewed her participation in the Civil War as merely one chapter in a longer struggle for Cherokee survival, a perspective that proved tragically prescient. Following the Union victory in 1865, pressure on the remaining Cherokee lands in North Carolina and Tennessee intensified as Reconstruction brought new waves of settlement and development to the region. The journal's final legible entry, dated November 18, 1863, just weeks before Sarah's presumed death, contained a passage that researchers found particularly moving. "I dreamed of my children last night, standing by the river where we used to gather fish in spring. They asked when I would join them in the nightland. Soon, I told them. The medicine shows me that my path grows short. I have taken 37 fingers, and with them made a shield of fear around our mountains. When I am gone, the others will continue. The Cherokee have faced death before, and remained. We will remain again." This entry not only foreshadowed her own death, but revealed her belief that her actions had created a lasting protective influence around Cherokee territories, a spiritual barrier that would continue to operate after her physical passing. In the century and a half since Sarah Walking Stick's death, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has maintained their presence in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, preserving their culture and language despite continuing pressures. Whether through coincidence or more mysterious workings, the regions where Sarah operated most actively remained among the areas where Cherokee presence and land ownership proved most resilient in the decades following the Civil War. The discovery of Sarah's burial site and the subsequent research has prompted significant reconsideration of how historians understand both Native American involvement in the Civil War and the broader question of indigenous resistance to colonization. Rather than seeing Native Americans as passive victims or minor participants in larger historical processes, Sarah's story reveals sophisticated strategic adaptation, using the conflicts of the colonizing culture as opportunities to advance indigenous survival. Dr. Running Wolf explained, "What makes Sarah's story so significant is how it demonstrates indigenous agency and strategic thinking. She wasn't simply reacting to events or being swept up in the white man's war. She was deliberately leveraging the conflict to create space for Cherokee survival. using methods that maintained cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances. The artifacts from Sarah's burial, the modified uniform, the customized weapon, the ritual objects, and especially the preserved fingers of her enemies, have raised complex questions about their appropriate treatment and display. After extensive consultation with Cherokee tribal authorities, most items have been reburied in a private ceremony, with only non-human remains retained for research and limited educational display. These aren't simply historical artifacts, noted Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Charles Blackfox during the reburial ceremony in 2019. They are sacred objects imbued with spiritual power and human remains that demand respectful treatment according to Cherokee traditions. Sarah Walkingstick fought to protect our people and culture. We continue that fight by ensuring her spiritual tools and the remains of those connected to her are treated with appropriate reverence. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has incorporated Sarah's story into their cultural heritage programs, presenting her not as a simplistic figure of vengeance, but as a complex defender who operated within traditional Cherokee spiritual and ethical frameworks while adapting to the realities of 19th-century warfare. Sarah Walkingstick represents what anthropologists call indigenization, the process by which Native peoples adapted foreign elements into their own cultural frameworks rather than simply assimilating, explained Dr. Tallchief. She wore a Union uniform but transformed it with Cherokee symbols and practices. She used Western firearms but modified them according to Cherokee spiritual principles. She engaged with the Civil War but reframed it as part of the longer struggle for Cherokee sovereignty and survival. This process of indigenization offers important insights for understanding how Native American cultures have maintained continuity despite centuries of colonization and forced assimilation. Rather than simply rejecting all aspects of European American culture or passively accepting them, indigenous communities like the Cherokee actively transformed and incorporated selected elements into their own cultural systems, maintaining core values and practices while adapting to changing circumstances. Sarah's story also challenges conventional narratives about gender in both Native American and European American contexts. While Cherokee society traditionally offered women more autonomy and political voice than European American society of the same period, female warriors remained exceptional. Sarah appears to have navigated between these cultural expectations, leveraging traditional Cherokee respect for women's power while expanding the boundaries of conventional gender roles. She wasn't just transgressing white gender norms by fighting as a woman, noted Dr. Strongbow. She was also pushing the boundaries of traditional Cherokee gender roles, though in ways that connected to deeper Cherokee traditions about women's power and spiritual authority. The journal suggests she understood herself not as violating Cherokee traditions, but as drawing on older, sometimes dormant aspects of those traditions to meet extraordinary circumstances. The DNA analysis of Sarah's remains provided an additional dimension to her story. Along with confirming her Cherokee ancestry, it revealed European genetic markers consistent with having at least one grandparent of Scottish or Irish descent, a common pattern among Cherokee in the 19th century, following generations of trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange with European settlers. This mixed ancestry doesn't make her less Cherokee, as some early critics of our findings suggested, emphasized Dr. Running Wolf. It makes her representative of the actual lived reality of most Cherokee people by the 19th century. Indigenous identity has never been about genetic purity, but about cultural connection, community belonging, and shared values and practices. In this sense, Sarah Walkingstick embodied the complex reality of Native American identity in a colonial context, maintaining fierce commitment to Cherokee culture and sovereignty while physically embodying the history of contact and exchange between indigenous and European populations. Her story defies simplistic categorizations, revealing instead the nuanced ways actual individuals navigated between cultural worlds. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Sarah's story is how it has resonated with contemporary Cherokee people, particularly women. Since the public announcement of the archaeological findings in 2018, Cherokee women veterans have held annual ceremonies honoring Sarah's memory and connecting her story to their own service in American military forces. Mary Blackfeather, a Cherokee veteran who served in Afghanistan, explained the significance. Sarah Walkingstick shows us that Cherokee women have always been warriors when our people needed protection. She fought using both the weapons of the enemy and the spiritual practices of our ancestors. Today, we continue that tradition, serving in the U.S. military while maintaining our Cherokee identity and values. Her story reminds us that we aren't abandoning our culture by serving. We're continuing a tradition of Cherokee adaptation and resilience that goes back centuries. This contemporary resonance underscores perhaps the most important aspect of Sarah's story. It isn't simply a historical curiosity, but a living legacy that continues to inform how Cherokee people, particularly women, understand their place in both Cherokee tradition and American society. As archaeological research at the site continues, with additional areas still being carefully excavated, historians and archaeologists remain open to the possibility of discovering more about Sarah and her network of Cherokee women fighters. Ground-penetrating radar has identified several anomalies in the surrounding area that may represent additional burials or caches of supplies and weapons. We've only begun to uncover this chapter of history, noted Dr. Running Wolf. The traditional historical narrative of the Civil War has focused overwhelmingly on the experiences and actions of white men on both sides. Stories like Sarah's remind us how many other participants, women, Native Americans, African Americans, shaped the conflict in ways that have remained largely invisible in conventional histories. As we conclude this extraordinary journey through a hidden chapter of American history, we're left with a story far more complex and provocative than most Civil War narratives. Sarah Walkingstick was neither a perfect hero nor a simple villain. She was a woman responding to traumatic loss and existential threat with the cultural tools and spiritual frameworks available to her. Her methods may disturb modern sensibilities, but they reflected both the brutal realities of her time and the deep spiritual traditions of her people. For those who believe, there may be another dimension to consider in Sarah's story. Throughout Scripture, we see how God often works through unlikely instruments to achieve protection for vulnerable communities. From Deborah leading Israel into battle to Jael driving a tent peg through an enemy commander's head, biblical history is filled with women who took up the mantle of warrior when circumstances demanded. Like them, Sarah Walkingstick stood in defense of her people when conventional protections had failed, guided by spiritual convictions that gave meaning and purpose to her actions. The finger bones buried with Sarah Walkingstick, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this archaeological discovery, remind us that history in its unvarnished reality is often more challenging than the sanitized versions presented in textbooks. They represent a spiritual practice alien to modern Western sensibilities, but deeply meaningful within the cultural context that produced it. They challenge us to stretch our understanding beyond comfortable assumptions about how humans have made meaning of violence, death, and survival throughout history. The next time you drive through the misty mountains of eastern Tennessee or western North Carolina, consider that beneath that spectacular beauty lies a complex history of conflict, resistance, and survival. The peaceful hills that now draw tourists and nature enthusiasts once witnessed a woman warrior's desperate fight to protect what remained of her people and culture. A fight conducted with both physical weapons and spiritual power, according to traditions far older than the nation that now claims those territories. Sarah Walkingstick's finger collection may have shocked modern historians, But perhaps what should shock us more is how readily we forget the desperation of those fighting not for abstract political principles, but for the very survival of their communities and ways of life. Her story compels us to reconsider not just the Civil War, but the entire process of American nation-building, from the perspective of those who fought to maintain their sovereignty and cultural identity amid overwhelming pressure. In that reconsideration lies the possibility not just of a more complete understanding of our shared past, but of greater wisdom as we face the ongoing challenges of building a society that respects the diverse traditions and experiences that have shaped our common history. Perhaps, like the finger bones preserved through Sarah's spiritual practices, certain essential truths about our national story have been preserved underground, waiting for the right moment to be revealed, challenging us to see our history through different eyes and to acknowledge the complex humanity of those who came before us.